The series brings together distinguished scholars to the university to share their work with faculty, students, and our broader community of alumni and friends of the department, continuing Thomas Scheidel's legacy of excellence in scholarship and communication. And we are incredibly grateful to Thomas Scheidel's family and friends who generously make this event possible. I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Professor Adrian Russell, to introduce this evening's speaker. But a few words about Adrian. Professor Russell is the Mary Laird Wood Professor of Communication and co-director of the department's Center for Communication, Journalism, Media, and Democracy. Professor Russell's research focuses on emerging technologies and pressing social problems, and specifically how to foster democratic and participatory publics. Somewhat important subject matter. She has co-edited 3 books and has authored 3 monographs, including Networked, A Contemporary History of News in Transition, and Journalism as Activism, Recoding Media Power. Her most recent book, released last summer by Columbia University Press, is entitled The Mediated Climate, How Journalists, Big Tech, and Activists Are Vying for Our Future. It explores the overlapping climate and information crises, examining how journalism, activism, and big tech compete to influence the public. So please help me in welcoming Adrian Russell.
Very kind introduction for a small role I'm playing in this evening, but thank you, Christine. And welcome to Silvio. I am so excited to have Silvio here. As Christine mentioned, he's professor at the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. He's also president of the International Communication Association, which is one of our field's flagship professional associations. He's the author and editor of 19 books and articles on journalism, politics, media, and communication for social change. And nobody knows how he can write so well, so fast, but we're still working on figuring that out. Silvio has been working to expand and improve the field of communication for decades. So, among other things, he's led efforts to de-Westernize our scholarship by insisting that we address the biases that come along with US and European focuses. And he's really done a ton of work at the institutional level, also with mentoring scholars from the Global South that has really affected a change, I think, in our field. He's also a leading voice in calling for more and better articulated public scholarship. And I encourage you all to check out the just published book of his called Public Scholarship in the Field of Communication Studies. Earlier today, we had a really great conversation about moving the field more towards issues of engaged scholarship and kind of moving away from this idea of public intellectualism and more towards engagement and really focusing our work on issues of public relevance and working with publics and communities. And so these commitments are really echoed in his research. I've had the opportunity to work on various projects and publications with Silvio over the course of my career. And in fact, he was the editor of my very first peer-reviewed article. And he was very kind to me, and I was very young, and it was probably not that good. So I can say that not only is he a stellar thinker and leader in the field, but he's also an exceptionally generous collaborator and mentor. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Silvio here today to talk about his research on violence against journalists. And what the format will be is he's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for a discussion, questions, and answers. So please note them down, think about how you want to engage, and we'll have plenty of time for that after. So welcome, Silvio.
Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Andrea. And thank you very much for the invitation, everybody who was part of this process. It's a pleasure to be here and honored to be invited to give this the Shadow Lecture. So what I wanted to talk about, they asked me to talk about questions around anti-press violence. So what I want to talk about is ideas in progress, something that builds off a few articles that I wrote in the last years, and then I am still thinking about whether or not there is a book here, or there is, one or two more articles. So I'm in that process right now. So, and my interest now is to provide a more sort of conceptual understanding when we talk about different forms of violence against the press, and so I'm curious to see where this is going to take me next in terms of what I'm going to find out, or how to bring this project to the next stage. So for the past years, I think there has been a significant amount of literature, academic literature, as well as reports by freedom of the press associations around the world, journalistic unions, about troubling news in the world of journalism, about the multiplication of different forms of violence against the press worldwide. I developed an early interest in this question back in the 90s, basically because originally from Latin America, and it has been very difficult to understand essential aspects of journalistic practice without understanding violence. So that seemed like a natural thing that I gravitated towards understanding. At a time when actually this issue was not very prominent in the Western literature for a number of clear reasons, because of the question of either state violence or violence situation of weak or absent states has not been critical in North America or in much of Western Europe. The situation in the Global South was different, so the issue was basically a matter of interest for scholars interested in the Global South. But things have changed, unfortunately, in the last 15, 20 years, and there is growing interest among scholars based in the Global North in understanding multiple forms of violence. So here we are now on something that has become a global issue, and something that scholars from around the world have been investigating. And a lot of research has been done. Very interesting research in terms of documenting the situation of different forms of violence, and I want to recognize the work that Jen Hemmerich has done in this regard, in understanding not only what are the causes, but what is the impact and the ways that journalists find ways to protect themselves from multiple forms of attacks. And the word, quote unquote, unprecedented has been used in unprecedented ways about this, and I don't think that is an exaggeration. So what I will do today is map some of the key questions around this, and then we can go into more detailed, specific cases in the conversation. So what is the problem? The problem is that safety of journalism is a global concern. That is a problem that has different characteristics and challenges among countries and regions. Not all journalists are similarly vulnerable to violence, something that we'll expand on in a few minutes. There are multiple actors who instigate, perpetrate, and legitimize anti-press violence. And widespread forms of online attacks have added complexity to this problem. Right. But before we get into the specifics about anti-press violence, let me talk about violence. And the reason is because violence is a contested concept in the literature of violence. And it's something that in the literature of journalism studies, it is assumed rather than sort of flesh out what we're talking about when we talk about violence, and what are the forms of violence. There are multiple definitions of what violence is, and I'm not going to settle this topic right here, but just to give you a background of what we're talking about and why this matters for journalism. Violence, I find it as the transgression, the violation of behavioral boundaries that make victims feel unsafe and harmed. And I'm choosing these words because it is very important to emphasize the impact on victims, right? Violence refers to behaviors that cause harm, injury, trauma, and death. And violence is basically That's what I'm putting with the concept that is about, in some ways, the pursuit of doing harm to others. Harm is, and this definition comes from the World Health Organization, is physical or mental damage or injury that results from the violation of individual and collective rights. And this is important when we're thinking about violence against journalism. Harm entails pain, death, disability, loss of ability or freedom, and loss of pleasure. Why am I bringing this up? Because the definition of violence depends not only on the intention of one party, the perpetrator, but also on whether the other party, the victim, feel. That is, if they believe whether or not their safety has been violated. And we know that violence is a contested concept. If we look at different forms of violence in our societies, there has been an ongoing debate over how do we define, how do we construct what violence is. Think about violence like domestic violence and other forms of violence, which is a constant, really sort of social struggle for redefining what violence is and who determines what counts as violence, right? And the point here is that violence exists even if actors, perpetrators, do not deliberately set out to cause harm, or even if they don't use physical force or weapons, or do not recognize that they have harmed others. Even in situations where actors believe that certain acts, verbal, physical, or symbolic, are not intended to cause harm or are performed just for fun, and this is an issue that comes out very strongly in online harassment, online attacks, meaning it's just fun, I'm just kidding you, I'm just messing with you. It is a question that how do we define interactively what violence is. So now let me talk about violence against journalists. The working definition I have is that it refers to actions that inflict harm on journalists by endangering their personal and professional safety. And journalists are specifically targeted because of their work or because of their social identities, rather than being victims of general forms of violence. Right? What matters here is that violence disrupts journalists' sense of safety. But we know this in general. Violence disrupts a sense of safety for the targets, the victims of any act of violence. And this means the ability to control their life and work environment. When you feel that that sort of sense of protection has been broken, and not necessarily that it's a closure of achieving a sense of safety. When the sense of safety has been broken, feeling unsafe means assuming that harm is always possible. Right? It's not only repairing, but the sense that you cannot prevent violence from happening again. And what we know from, I would say, increasing number of studies on this issue, is that when journalists do not feel safe, they are less likely to feel confident and autonomous in their work. Right? Feeling unsafe negatively affects their well-being and their performance. And the point here is, let me emphasize, that the boundaries between violence and non-violence, safety and unsafety, are flexibly and socially contested. So this is the work that we do, those who are interested in this. Basically, it is a way of redefining where the boundaries are and redefining what violence is against those who negate that psychological violence or harassment or verbal violence is violence. What do forms of anti-press violence have in common? Well, what they have in common is that they are attempts to impose someone's will over the speech and the professional rights of journalists. These are attempts to make perpetrators' speech louder in ways that pressure journalists to comply with certain norms and actions and be driven to force silence. You want to call it censorship? Yes, it is a form of censorship. It is a form, intimidation is about silence. That's what violence is about. The purpose of anti-press violence is censorship. Is to push news organizations to silence and to drive journalists to question their psychological and physical integrity and develop a heightened self-awareness about potential violent reactions to their reporting. Violence is a mode of social domination. These are not my words. Extensive literature has made exactly that argument. That violence is a form of exercising social power. The violence about structures and processors. It's not an episode. It is about a continuous form of domination. Violence is intrinsic to a process of domination by which certain actors, individuals, groups, and institutions actually exercise power. That's what I think it is about. Violence is about exercising power. Always good to cite all right meals on this. All policies struggle for power. The ultimate kind of power is violence. This is the context in which we should see any form of anti-press violence. Right? Let me present very briefly what we know. What is the diagnosis of this complex, multi-layer global problem? First of all, that it unevenly affects reports in the global north and the global south. It is a global concern, but it takes very different dimensions. That's why it's very difficult to talk in very general terms, because specificities, particularities here do matter. In the global, much of the global south, it has been a structural, long-standing problem for journalists, for the reasons that probably you already mentioned. You know, in situations of authoritarianism, violence is embedded in the regime, the persecution of journalists. In situations where there is no state, there is sort of parastate groups that rule a certain area, violence is sort of the naked form of violence as a way to exercise power and impose the will over journalists, right? So in the global south, the combination of authoritarian regimes, conflict and war, as we have seen in recent years yet again, where we're talking about South Sudan, we're talking about Gaza, we're talking about, in the case of Ukraine, conflict and war, journalists are in the front lines of violence. Political turmoil, statelessness, and large-scale campaigns against journalists make the situation significantly worse outside the West. Second, violence does not affect all journalists similarly. And this is something that's not always recognized, only recently, which is some journalists can be in a relatively safe situation or have a sense of safety, and someone working next, sort of in the next cubicle next to them, has a completely different situation. What does it mean to be a journalist? Right? That in some ways we know that even violence in general does not affect all citizens equally, right? In any given society, whether it's in the global north or in the global south. And anti-press violence is not exception in the way that is socially distributed in a different way. There are specific clusters of journalists who are particularly prone to be victims of violence, right? And there is a significant amount of research that actually shows this. Let me highlight three categories. One are investigative reporters, or reporters who cover specific beats, especially among political polarization. If you cover, of course, white supremacy or far-right movements, you are a main target for violence. But if you cover environmental issues, if you cover health communication, particularly around vaccines, or any issue that has become polarized not only in this country, but elsewhere, you are a target of violence. Second, the intersectionality of violence, which again is not unique to journalism, of course. This is a reflection of social trends in the distribution of violence. Journalists are disproportionately targeted because of their gender, race, religion, ethnicity, and sexuality. And we have studies that actually show very similar patterns in otherwise very different countries. And third, specific publications that have been critical of the sitting administration or the regime are disproportionately targeted by violence. So this is important to keep in mind, and just let me give you some examples of the research that has been done documenting exactly this intersectionality of violence. There is this study, the Chilean Global Study of Online Violence Against Women Journalists, which was a UNESCO-funded supported work done by a team led by Julie Pisotti, that documented the situation of violence against women journalists around the world. I think the study consisted of 20 countries and has been published in different forms for the past years, and documented very similar patterns in terms of why women journalists are disproportionately targeted by different forms of violence. There are a number of newspaper articles, investigations, scholarly work around the intersectionality of violence, which basically tells a very similar story in different communities and different countries around the world. In the case of women journalists, partially as a reflection of the broader phenomenon of digital misogyny that continues to be studied in communication studies and in other disciplines. And journalists being sort of a prime target of women journalists of this kind of violence. There are so many studies around this. I don't want to sort of mention one and forget about others. But second is the question of the newsfeed, right? And here there are some similarities too across countries in terms of what are the issues that journalists cover that are more likely to bring to them quote-unquote unwanted attention, right? Especially when they promote their stories on social media or on media appearances in general. And this is what I was mentioning earlier. The third type is depending on news organizations. There is ample evidence, for example, about the United States, how some news organizations, journalists working for some news organizations, have been prime targets of different forms of violence. Third, I mentioned earlier briefly multiple perpetrators. These are different actors interested in sort of committing acts of violence against the press, authoritarian governments, administrations in democratic and illiberal governments with an anti-press agenda, as well as non-state actors, right? Including drug cartels, border security, military and police squads, insurrectionary movements, and so on. Something that is more widespread, of course, in the global south. One issue here comes to mind, of course, is the fact that the rise of far-right populism, I would say far-left populism or different forms of populism, have been central to this process. Right? We cannot understand anti-press violence without understanding that for different brands of populism, making the press or certain press as the enemy is central, not just to their policies, but fundamentally to their rhetoric. And populist leaders continuously use the power of the bullet pulpit for anti-press attacks. We continue to live in that situation, of course, in these countries. The tactics. I think that people who are enemies of the press are quite creative when it comes to ways to instill fear among journalists. There are traditional means to silence journalists: legal, surveillance, physical, and psychological violence, as well as widespread use of digital platforms for intimidation and harassment. And then there is a broad social and political context, something that I briefly mentioned earlier. The attacks on journalists should be seen as part of attacks on experts, or those who pursue, let's say, some kind of independent, autonomous production of knowledge that doesn't always sort of fit what people in government or citizens believe. And there is some research published in communication or outside of communication on increasing number of attacks on scientists and researchers amid rising populism as well as anti-science attitudes. With a colleague of mine, we did a research on science journalists a few years ago. We interviewed a good number of science journalists that suddenly they were receiving all kinds of attacks. People who have been science journalists for a long time in the past years, particularly after COVID, but even before that, people covering all kinds of scientific, almost esoteric issues suddenly were sort of pulled into sort of a constant set of attacks, right? With the consequence that I mentioned earlier. But also it's important to mention another set of literature that shows that public figures, politicians and celebrities, but particularly women politicians or women celebrities or minority politicians, minority celebrities, are disproportionately targeted by different forms of violence. So what we're seeing in journalism, in some ways, there is something that is unique to journalism, but something is a reflection of social trends about different forms of violence. Let me spend a few minutes talking about online harassment of journalists, because it's a particular case of anti-press violence, to the point that people have said this is the new normal, and it is the new normal. There are new forms of what I call mob censorship. I'm going to repeat what I already said about this, but in some ways there are different factors that explain why this form of attacks by citizens who see themselves as vigilantes, persecuting, harassing, going after journalists, has become a common sort of form of anti-press violence in countries around the world, right? Whether you have, a populist regime in government that is condoning, instigating, perpetuating these attacks or not, right? It is part of the larger context of rising digital hate, and there is an ample literature actually showing the multiple forms in which digital hate is organized. What is the impact of this beyond journalism? And that to me is something that, in some ways, it is a fundamentally different phenomenon. One could say that the mob attacks on the press is not new. This country has a long history, particularly in the 19th century, of mobs attacking African American newspapers and journalists, lynching and torching, lynching people and torching newsrooms. So this classic book by John Neron, among others, has documented exactly this kind of mob attacks is not new, but we're talking about digital mobs that basically are organized and commit acts of violence, primarily, but not only, primarily on digital spaces. And in some ways it is this sort of phenomenon of ordinary citizens emboldened to commit violent acts against journalists. And there are a number of studies that have actually do this. And here we're talking about sort of the role of instigators, right? Political and media elites who basically prime the attention or decide to go after certain journalists, as well as individual and coordinated actions just by ordinary citizens to go after journalists. It is sort of an example, if you want, of elite cues in rhetoric and actions on actual behaviors, right? And of course, all of this makes sense when you have demagogues on media demagogues or political demagogues who actually live off this and instigate this act. And here the evidence, I think, is very strong on the intersectionality of digital hate and the number of reports that actually have shown that mob censorship is basically targeted in this way, the way that I was mentioning earlier. What are the consequences? There are a number of studies that actually show this, and the consequences are what we might expect. Psychological trauma, feelings of being on your own amid attacks. This comes out very recurrently. I was part of the UNESCO report that I mentioned earlier, part of the US team. We did the interviews with sort of well-known women journalists, and consistently it was a running theme that they felt, no matter how prominent they are, sometimes they're anchors, they're well-known, that they are on their own when they are the target of attacks. The news organizations provide very little support in terms of safety, in terms of legal support, etc. And this is a recurrent theme that we find in many studies. And the consequence is that violence discourages reporters from going public, right? They sort of engage in sort of behaviors to become less public, to become less visible, as a way to protect themselves, not to be so vulnerable to these attacks, including dialing back the public and media presence, which, as we know, is central to the work that journalists do today in terms of having a social media presence or promoting their stories or reaching out to sources through social media. Self-censorship, which is, I recognize, something very difficult to study and to talk with journalists. very difficult to admit it. It's very difficult to ask the questions. Do you censor yourself? What do you understand by censorship? The research that I did when I wrote originally this paper on censorship, heard stories of reporters who asked their editors to be reassigned because they didn't want to cover certain political rallies because they did it once and said never again, or cover certain subjects that didn't have the stomach. And this is particularly at a time of a push for diversification of newsrooms. That minority of women journalists don't want to cover certain topics whose perspectives would be very interesting to have because they don't want to go through the trauma of covering actors, covering subjects that they know will increase the chances that they are target of attacks. So it is something that requires further documentation despite the difficulties, but we know enough about this. We know enough, and this is a problem, right? The reluctance to cover certain subjects out of fear. So, let's go to the solutions. I put this in yellow just because everything else so far is bleak. And let's see if we can have some light in this whole thing. That's the only way I put the yellow. So no GW colors. But so what is done? What should be done? By whom? With what goals? And I think this is probably not because we know enough. The diagnosis part is very important. The question is what do we do about this, considering the severity of the problem. First of all, the safety of reporters is not a single problem, but it comprises multiple forms and scenarios, right? For the reasons that I mentioned at the very beginning. We lack effective proven responses that are applicable to various situations and settings to increase journalist safety. And here to me is part of the frustration or the disappointment or the challenge is the fundamental asymmetry between the scale and impact of responses and multifaceted forms of violence, right? Between the tools that perpetrators have to actually exert violence on journalists. And on top of this, we have the challenge of digital violence, right? The situation to me is that we still don't have effective responses to the old problems. Kidnapping, murdering journalists, using draconian laws to censor journalists, sophisticated systems of surveillance of journalists, not only in authoritarian regimes, but as well as in democracies. So we don't have sort of effective solutions to those problems, and now we are dealing with a sort of multifaceted problem of online violence. People have tried to come up with sort of solutions, and I think this is very valuable because it helps us sort of think about what can be done. I think increasingly there's agreement of the power of peer support, networks of journalists helping each other on a variety of things, a variety of needs, whether it is psychological assistance, legal assistance, safety assistance. Yet much more needs to be known about what could work. And I think that increasingly my sense reading this literature is we must do more, we're not doing enough, but it's not clear what works. Right? There's no enough evidence to say this is what works under certain conditions. This may be a good idea, but it is limited. And much more research is needed around this. Again, there's a lot of research and sort of actually try to understand this. Conceptually, how do we think about this, right? And that's what I'm trying to figure out, what is sort of a different level of thinking about it, rather than just a case study, just a description of what the problem is and the solutions. I think, for example, when we talk about online harassment, reflect journalism's complex relation with publicity in the digital society. Publicity meaning being in public, that's what I mean. Think about solutions to digital violence. I don't think that it's clear what it is. And it's not for lack of trying. There are a number of sort of tips about do's and don'ts and digital safety for journalists as well as for politicians about how to have a digital presence which is critical to the work that journalists and others do. But it's not clear what works. But at the same time, the fact that we don't know what works raises questions about sort of all ways of thinking about this problem. Let me give you some examples. Should journalists engage with hate speech? One of the things that came out in many studies, including the interviews that I did, both with science journalists as well as a previous study, is that journalists don't support some form of speech restriction by the platforms themselves as a ways to protect themselves. Because fundamentally they believe that some form of free speech should be preserved no matter what it is. But at the same time, they don't want to engage with hate speech, right? We all know this. Don't feed the trolls. Don't engage with the trolls. Digital safety manuals will tell you probably the first thing we'll say, don't engage with that. It's not about having a conversation. It's not clear that counter speech works. It's not clear that more speech will defeat, bad speech. Think about John Stuart Mill, more speech. I think like, really? Don't we have plenty of more speech? Isn't part of the problem more speech? This doesn't mean to endorse anything of censorship, but I mean, clearly it shows that we don't have too many good responses to the larger problem of how you do, not just with hate speech, particularly in this country, but how you do with speech that actually leads journalism to self-censorship, right? And I put this in the black slide, not in the one with yellow, which is, maybe there's a problem that needs to be confronted but cannot be solved. And I'm clearly of two minds about it. That there are some things that effectively can help journalists, and some things that probably it's very difficult to envision how that will be possible. Solutions like, I don't know, legally going after instigators, for example. And I think that fundamentally journalism is in the front lines of the dilemmas of abandoned speech, in which you have a situation of criticism without civility, agonism without deliberation, and speech without dialogue. Right? So the traditional ways of thinking about how you combat bad speech is with more speech. It doesn't seem to be supported by all the advice about digital safety, which is basically about not engaging with attackers. And basically because there are no shown norms. Any communication scholar will tell you this. It's very difficult to engage in speech when there are no basic shared upon norms to have a conversation, right? It means the impossibility of dialogue, and there are a number of studies that actually show the complexity of these questions. So, what are the responses? What have been the responses? There are basically three kinds of responses that have been continued to be attempted: individual, collective, and social, different levels of intervention. At the individual level, there have been primarily a question about tough it out, to refuse to avoid with people, right? Digital safety instructions are basically formulated how to be safe as an individual online, how you continue doing your work as a journalist by minimizing the chances. So you avoid, you strategically avoid, trouble. Sometimes you can't. Why? Because of who you are, what people perceive of you, because of the work that you do. That's not a choice, depending on what you cover. You don't have the luxury to basically say that. And of course, grow a thick skin, which several studies have found this, it doesn't seem to be a good answer to actually address the fundamental problem that we're dealing with. Right? Then there's the collective efforts for confronting digital hate. And many news organizations have done work on this, nonprofits have done work on this, journalistic unions about providing sort of ways to protect journalists from this kind of attacks. There are a number of platforms and software to report attacks. that news organizations unevenly have adopted. And then there is a more difficult thing, which is more like, let's say, support for news organizations and colleague associations. And this widely varies across news organizations and across countries. And it's not clear what works in some news organizations or countries might work somewhere else. But primarily I think that what is telling here is the weak minimal responses to this interest from governments and tech platforms, right? Unless governments see this as a fundamental question of press freedom, it's very difficult to think that just journalists organizing themselves or individual news organizations, this is a social problem. This is not a problem that just affects some news organizations. And the same thing goes with the tech platforms who have done, in some cases, a few things, but not enough to address the problem, because much of what it is online harassment takes place in their properties. And what is needed is different kinds of actions: preventive, palliative, and repair actions. How to prevent, how to help journalists, and how to repair the damage, the harm being done by violent actors. So there are multiple challenges here for the different solutions. If you're expecting me to tell you this is the solution, sorry. The complexity of the problem, sort of explaining the complexity of the solutions, which has to do with the lack of sufficient awareness, disinterest, the lack of political will, and the lack of recognition of this as a problem of freedom of the press, right? Ultimately, we know from other cases, and I'll give you some examples in the conversation, solutions need to be localized and grounded in nuanced understandings of the problems and conditions. And multiple kinds of actions are needed as well. One might work in some settings, for example, the European Union, that has taken in some cases a much more active way of dealing with these questions, may not be applicable in other contexts where the political and legal circumstances as well as resources, funding and technology are different. In principle, we should aim for having journalists to report and give responses to the violations of safety inside and outside news organization. For the most part, this has happened within news organization rather than more sort of public ways to do that, right? So there are a number of studies here, but we know from other countries, and in case of Latin America makes sense, Mexico and Colombia particularly, is the value of collective practices. This is something that comes from the journalists. It rarely comes from news organizations or from governments, as a way to find ways to protect each other, to report attacks. And this seems to be, especially in the absence of all these other sort of potential solutions, a way to address the problem, right? The question is that when all these more like social or collective solutions are weak or non-existent, what happens is individual strategic silence, individual solutions, because journalists are not waiting for somebody to basically help them address these very difficult situations. So here what we have is this, that when there are collective failures, societies fail to protect the rights, the professional and individual rights of journalists. Journalists basically are left with pursuing individual solutions, individual actions. Survival strategies, what I mentioned earlier, strategic silence, right? Amid slow, limited, and ineffective social responses. So what are the conclusions? So can journalists be safe in a violent world? Silvio, what is your answer? Well, I think what we are seeing here is journalists are carrying the coal mine of conditions for public expression across political regimes and legal systems. This is part of a broader problem, that journalists are sort of in the front lines of these sort of multiple social, political, technological processes that I just described. Here we're dealing with structural solutions, and that's why this seems like an intractable problem. We're dealing with authoritarian politics and illiberalism. We're dealing with toxic hate politics and discourse amid the surge of anti-democratic, anti-rights, intolerant politics. We are dealing with sort of anti-press politics. And we are dealing with the conditions in the digital public sphere, meaning communication without agreed upon normative guardrails, in which basically anything goes, especially given the policies that social media platforms have endorsed. Let me close with this. Practicing journalism, I would say something pretty obvious, but it's not always visible. Practicing journalism requires being in public. That's what journalism is about, particularly at a time of heightened digital publicity. And Hannah Arendt, of course, talking about citizens and not about journalists, said that being in public means having to leave the protective security of our four walls and enter the public realm. Citizens might have a choice. Journalists typically don't have a choice. They are, by definition, in public. So being in public makes journalists vulnerable to violence, right? Different forms of violence in societies. So what we need to understand is that actually thinking about how to pursue the safety of journalists in a violent world, we're not dealing with the structural causes driving violence, right? It is tied to pursuing virtual paths of action for plural and tolerant societies. It's part of the same struggle, right? And this is a collective problem that demands collective actions to which we don't have obvious ready-made solutions. And I'm putting that in the yellow box as a way of thinking creatively, imaginatively about ways to do it, while we recognize some of the most knotty questions around the situation. Thank you very much.